We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Mankind Podcast. Today I'm sitting with Ed Frauenheim. Ed and I sit in a group together called the Moonshot Mission for Mankind, which is convened by Jed Diamond and a small group of men and women from different organizations who are sitting to talk about how to encourage and support men living longer by doing those things that help us be healthier and happier and more connected. In this conversation with Ed, we'll hit on some of the factors that are driving the opposite, driving the poor health outcomes, driving the disparity in how long men and women live. Personal experiences, especially in early childhood, mine, Ed's, probably yours too if you're a man. When you let them emerge, these experiences and what we're taught, we got set up. Some of the fundamentals that may have helped me survive in some ways have actually had long-term negative impacts. They have negative impacts society-wide on men. It didn't start with us. That's what we're going to talk about. The provocative thesis that Ed puts forward is that our nature as men, the narrative we're told about what it means to be men, has been corrupted. The current perspectives in anthropology, sociology, psychology, neuroscience are very different than what the academy has been saying for a long time. And there's some great books that we'll bring out in the episode. What if progress, as we've understood it, is actually killing us? So we talk about the idea of circle and arrow masculinity. You'll hear about that in the episode. We also talk a little bit about integral thinking and how bringing a Teal perspective can help us develop more soulful organizations and workplaces and improve business performance. So how can we help and support one another and succeed? The bottom line, as you'll hear Ed say in the episode, is that liberating masculinity is about supporting men to move from rigid, cold, and isolated into embracing something more in a world that needs men's agility, warmth, and connection. Hope you enjoy. Hey everybody, it's Boysen Hodgson with the Mankind Podcast, the podcast where we are setting out to prove that there is more than one way to be a man. And today I'm excited to sit down with someone who I'm just getting to know, haven't been in relationship with for a super long time, Ed Frauenheim. And I'll tell you a little bit about Ed. So I knew of Ed before I met Ed because of his most recent book. And then Ed and I ended up in a group with Jed Diamond, who I've interviewed for the podcast before, called the Moonshot Mission for Mankind. So over the course of the last number of months, we've been spending time together and really focusing on men's health and longevity and how we can work together and bring organizations together to increase men's health, improve men's health. And I've really enjoyed getting to know Ed. So he's been studying workplace and technology and culture matters for 2.5 decades. He's had stories featured in USA Today, Fortune, Wired. For 6 years, he was the director of content at Great Place to Work, the consultancy that produces the annual Fortune 100 Best Companies to Work For list. We're going to touch on that. He's a co-author of 4 books. His newest book, which I've already kind of alluded to, is called Reinventing Masculinity, The Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection, which he co-authored with Dr. Ed Adams. Reinventing Masculinity talks about how we're moving from outdated, unhealthy, confined ways of being a man to more liberating masculinity that embraces compassion and connection. We're definitely going to spend time with that today. Ed lives in San Francisco. He has 2 teenage kids and an artist wife. Maybe we'll even hit that. In his spare time, you'll find him swimming, dancing to Daft Punk, and playing disc golf. And that makes me wonder how old his LinkedIn profile is, if Daft Punk is in his LinkedIn profile. So, Ed, welcome. I'm glad to be with you today, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Boysen. Such an honor to be here with you on your show.
Thank you. So I'm going to dive right in. I try to introduce. So, and this is from the prologue, the very beginning of Reinventing Masculinity. There's a statement made that our natures as men have been corrupted. How have our natures, our basic natures as men, been corrupted?
Thanks for highlighting that, Boysen. Yeah, it's a big claim, isn't it?
Yeah.
That claim comes from research into deep human existence and sort of the hunter-gatherer societies that made up 95 to 99% of our time as human beings, and other kinds of research that shows basically that we have cut off a bunch of our humanity as guys in the typical masculinity that's been given down to us, passed down to us, maybe for the last 3 to 5, 10,000 years, such that we've really lost these terms that we put in the headline of the book, the compassion and connection pieces. We've told ourselves that we're mostly about competition and stoicism, non-emotional behaviors, and really about being apart from others, self-reliant to the point of isolation. So at a high level, we've really lost this sense of ourselves as compassionate, connected human beings in the kind of masculinity that we've been socialized into for much of, basically from agrarian civilization onward, is how I see it.
So this is research stuff. So we're talking about anthropology, and if you could highlight a couple. This is testing, right? I'm testing you. What are a couple of great books or a couple of things that you kind of are go-tos on this discussion?
Civilized to Death by Christopher Ryan is one of my new Bibles in recent years, and it is it's academic research popularized, you might say, in a little bit of a manifesto or takes a strong point of view, but basically, he calls out the research on hunter-gatherer forager societies, not necessarily just from the point of view of masculinity and femininity, but more generally, and notes that for most of our human existence, we have been governed by 3 principles: egalitarianism, gratitude, and autonomy, such that we're about sharing, we're about being, coming from a sense of abundance. We got a lot here, and you can't boss anybody around. And we've moved to a place which is highly unequal, where we have a sense of scarcity, and we're feeling like we have to control people all the time, especially in our organizations, or that's one place where it happens a lot. So that book really kind of rocked my world. And the fellow that wrote the foreword to our book, I don't know if you remember it, but by Paul Gilbert, he's someone who's studied, he references Christopher Ryan and other scholars to point out that the setting and the culture matter so much for how we show up as men, and that we have the ability to be deeply compassionate, and it gets kind of beaten out of us in the course of our socialization. And I know you've probably seen some other work by like Niobe, was it Way?
Yep, Niobe Way. Yep.
And the work she's done on childhood relationships that sour, of course, across the sort of adolescent years, and just it's heartbreaking stuff about how we get that affection for each other as guys, and that ability to sort of be heart-centered. It gets kind of lost and not just lost, but really kind of forced out of us in our current society. So, did I pass the test?
That's super. And I also want to bring in as another one, Dawn of Everything, David Graeber. Do you know that book?
I don't know that. Tell me about it.
Oh, so David Graeber and what's the other author's name? David Wengrow. So it's 2 Davids. The Dawn of Everything: A New History of Humanity. It's a gigantic tome, huge tome. Very similar, though. Like they go back and they use the anthropological research and all of that kind of evolutionary psychology research and stuff, and they take a new perspective on it, which is to say we've had this kind of incrementalism as a frame for how we view the evolution of societies. We went from this to, we went from hunter-gatherer societies to early agrarian societies to kind of warrior-based societies to kind of, early civil societies and da-da-da-da. And they look at the evidence from, the Southern Hemisphere and West Coast of the United States and all the early European and then Middle Eastern cultures and Near Eastern cultures. And they kind of say, you know what? This whole like progression thing that we've been talking about, it doesn't really play that way.
I gotta
People
read it.
do all sorts of things and flip back and forth, and societies can go from being, very focused on one thing and very dominant and very hierarchical, and then flip back into very, equal. And I love the three words. So I'm going to say egalitarianism, gratitude, and autonomy. And I am certain that Graeber and Wengrow would go right along with those.
Love that.
People don't like to be told what to do. And if you look at the records from a perspective outside of our kind of progress driven, past 200 years of research kind of stuff, that's what we find in the records is like, we don't like to be told what to do. We like to relate to abundance in very healthy ways. And we pretty much get along as equals when there's not an imposition of hierarchy on us.
There's this, I love that, Boysen. I want to check out that book. Thank you for putting that on my radar screen. There's a story from the Civilized to Death book that just really stuck with me. It was about some English explorers or conquerors bringing some indigenous Southern American folks to London and having dinner at a fancy restaurant. And outside the restaurant are people begging and dying in the streets. And the indigenous folks said, "Why aren't they coming in and killing you?" Because that's how counter to nature that kind of level of inequality was to them from their perspective. Like, how can you not go out and give them food right now? And they ought to be coming in and, taking your life for this affront to the egalitarian values that we have. And this is pretty much what Ryan's citing is studies that did like meta-analysis, right? Across virtually all the studies of current hunter-gatherer tribes, as well as the anthropological record that you're getting at, is that's just what these scholars have synthesized and said. This is pretty common. It's rare to see anyone that doesn't follow those three principles. And I would say, if I could jump to the present a bit, Boysen, I don't know if
totally.
You want to interject here.
No.
Okay, so the other thing that makes me convinced this is true is that as I see what's possible if you can get past the blinders of our typical socialization as guys, and I've experienced it with you, and this Moonshot Project and I visited a Mankind Project meeting in researching the book, seeing my co-author Ed Adams with the men's group he started called Men Mentoring Men. Yep. We do have this capacity, deep capacity for connection, for friendship, for emotional availability and intelligence. And, a term that my buddy Jim Young and I use is arrow and circle men. Using the masculine circle or symbol rather, with the circle at the bottom and left and the arrow going up to the right. And we are almost all about the arrow over the last 3,000 to 5,000 years. We forgot the circle, and that's about the connection, the receptivity, the vulnerability, the community. But it's there. It's in us, that we're wired for compassion, all this kind of brain research is finding this. So that's why I feel strongly that, yes, our basic natures as men have been corrupted, Boysen.
We forgot about the circle. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Love that.
Thank you. Yeah, Jim and I collectively kind of came up with that, but I think it's a helpful, simple thing to just look at this symbol that we all agree to. This is our manly symbol. It looks like a penis, it looks like an erect penis on some level, but go back, right. It's not just to see it as the testes or the scrotum if you look at the circle, but that can be seen as also nurturing and bringing the next generation to life. And we lose sight of that nurturer role as guys often also. right? And how we can be fathers. So there's a lot, you can play around these symbols, but I do think there's new possibilities as more and more guys are seeing that there's more to us than we've been told is there.
Beautiful. And I think we could also go down, and I think you and I would be in alignment and agreement on much of this also, is let's separate biology from socialization. Let's kind of get real clear about distinctions around masculine, feminine, male, female, sex, gender, like all of those things. So we have, as a culture, at some point decided that this is the bucket. These are all the characteristics that are supposed to be in this bucket. Yeah. These are all the characteristics, and don't mix them, don't exchange them, and don't cross the lines, right? And I think the more research that comes out, historical, social, neurological, psychological, the more stuff that we learn about these things is like the more bullshit that is.
Yes. Amen to that. I love the way you're calling in all those different spheres. And I think it's helpful to talk about, even though guys don't like to hear this, like we have a feminine side, just like women can have a masculine side. If we think about these as energies or archetypes, I think that's helpful. But I'm finding more and more guys being willing to talk about that stuff and not see it as immediately threatening their manhood, and their identity. But that's still powerful. Those forces, those pressures that keep us from, going there. That's work in front of us.
I think that's beautiful, and that's something that comes up in the moonshot when we're having these conversations. Is there are some serious, profound risks with bucking any of these systems.
Yeah. And go ahead.
I'm going to lead you into telling a story about how deeply ingrained these kind of beliefs are. But this is something that I'll preface by saying, like, guys getting involved in men's work, right? This is the Mankind podcast. This is men's work that we're talking about. This is kind of this exploration of other ways of being. One of the most profound risks is like, what are the men? What are my bros? What are the dudes? What are my coworkers going to think about me if they know that I have hugged, cried, been vulnerable, opened up to, told stories, been sensitive with, nurtured other men?
Yeah.
There's like profound risks in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the men thinkers that captures that so well, or two of them maybe, are Mark Green. Maybe you talked to him or heard. He just talks about that dominator culture and how everyone is kept in line to prevent guys from going out and speaking that truth, that there is more to us, and that we can be emotionally expressive, and it doesn't mean we aren't men still, or we aren't good people. And then some of the work of Bell Hooks, who talks about the way in which that love is just killed in boys. Those are some of my heroes on that front. And I think you're right. It takes a lot of guts to do the kind of confession that, it shouldn't be a confession, but it feels like a confession to say, yeah, I've hugged my brothers and found release and relief and joy in that deep intimacy with them. Yeah,
very well said. Thank you.
One piece of hope along those lines, unless you want to take me in another direction.
No, please.
Prompted me a story.
One piece of hope.
Please. I just literally got off the phone with one of my high school friends, and a neat experience for me was to reconnect on just a text thread with like 13 other middle school and high school pals, and many of them I hadn't talked to in a decade or more. And we were, your typical mid 50 guys at this point. Nice guys, but also, operating in that what we would call confined masculinity, the man box growing up. And yet I've had a number of like one-on-one conversations with them, and they go to these emotional places. One was just telling me about a kid who's had mental health problems. I had another one talked about the challenges of not connecting well with virtually anybody in his life. And now we're starting, even in the collective text thread, being willing to talk about some of the challenges as fathers. So I just am hopeful that even if we grew up with those blinders on in that box, we can get out. And going back to our childhood friendships is a neat path, I think, for us to try to reconnect with some guys and experiment with a deeper level of intimacy and connection.
Thank you. That's very well said.
Of course.
Yeah. I resonate with that. I'm 51, so you and I aren't very far apart. Ed and I have lots of things in common about kind of relationship in our marriages, and both of us are dads to teenagers. And I think that the access point of having teens today, in today's culture, let's talk about teenagers just a little bit we don't have to tell our kids stories or anything, but I know what it was like being a teenager in the 1980s.
Yep.
And when I look at what my kids are facing in terms of social media culture right now, in terms of the kind of existential threat that they are 100% aware of, environmental threat and economic threat, and they've been aware of all the race of everything going on racially and like all of these things. I find that it's one way of accessing men, these dads, is to say, hey, let's talk about our kids. We love our kids.
I love that, Boysen. I've done a little work with fathers and Fathering Together and the Third Path Institute, but I think you're right that I've tended to be more in operating in organizations, but what a great point that's a place where you immediately kind of can melt a guy's heart, or it's an opportunity to get the barriers down and say, what the conversation with my friend just a second ago was. And one of the earlier ones too, is that he had he had some challenges with his kids. So I agree with you. It's a great opportunity.
Yeah. Cool. Let's talk a little bit about, can I out you as going to yoga class? And there was a story that you just told.
I'm happy. I'm a proud yogi. Yeah.
So, and again, here's another one of those things, right? It's like real men don't do yoga.
Right.
I'm sorry. Have you ever been in a yoga class with some of these guys who have been doing yoga? Don't like tell me that these are
right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they're like I'm there with like these buff dudes around me, like I'm feeling unmanly,
Right. So tell us a story about yoga.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that was a neat experience I had in a yoga class the other day. Was just going through this path of the old way of thinking about men and myself as a man, and then breaking through to this what we would call liberating, or this arrow and circle masculinity. Because basically I just, I have a wonderful yoga teacher named Steph Snyder, and she tells parables and stories, just get you in that meditative mindset besides the physical exertion and flow. And I just was kind of ruminating at some point about this exchange I'd had with a guy who was doing men's work, and it's really, impressive stuff. And he's got a great plan to get into organizations. And I saw this beautiful post he had on LinkedIn about an emotional encounter related to his family and an exchange with someone. And it got like 3 times the LinkedIn likes that I usually get when I do posts. And I just started going down that path of like, I can't work with him. He's got too big of a following. He'll be the man. If I work with him, I'll be below him in clout and power. And then, because I was in this class, and I think there was a metaphor of like Kali, the Hindu god, like destroying suffering or destroying some monsters. And the yoga teacher, Steph Snyder, was talking about how that's how we can slay our own suffering, which often comes from comparison, right? And excess competition. I was like, how silly is that? I'm going back to the same story that I tell others to be mindful of and get out of, this confined narrative of us as always about rivals with other guys and not as collaborators, as connecting. And then so that ended in this, the end of yoga is a shavasana, this resting pose. If you're a yogi too, it looks like your thing. I'm outing you now as a yoga doer. And I just had this little mantra that came to my mind of, you are fine, you are divine, and you are mine. And it was this, it just felt like I was channeling some deeper spiritual worth. Like, first it was more like self-reassurance, but then it was like remembering this divine spark that I do believe that we all have, and that is often encouraged by some yogic classes that have a spiritual component. And the you are mine part, I think, was interesting, as it was almost, I was being like claimed by divine power, and I think that's part of the connection piece that I think a lot of guys lose. And I know there's research that I at one point studied, like men are much less likely to feel spiritual than women, or maybe not much less, but they're less likely. And that sense of spiritual connection can be a source of this wider way of being a guy in a fuller life. So and we can think, the old model would say, oh, you don't want to be reliant on God or a spiritual source, because you're a rock, you're an island. I know, as Simon and Garfunkel was saying, like, but there's so much promise to and a requirement, I would argue, to see ourselves as interdependent, as connected to whatever kind of God you want to talk about. But I find it deeply reassuring, deeply satisfying, deeply energizing. And so that was my yoga epiphany to, like, gosh, it's so easy to fall back into those old stories, those old ways of seeing ourselves as small as men, and a small way of being a man. And it's so powerful when we can break out of that and have a bigger view of ourselves.
If you're enjoying the Mankind podcast, how about checking out an online men's group? Imagine a brotherhood where men really listen and support each other to be the best of who they are. It's free, confidential, and facilitated. Groups are available multiple times every week. Find out more in the show notes.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story. That's yes, that's great. And I like that you actually brought in that kind of, you are mine is a referential perspective, right? It's a perspective taking exercise.
Yeah.
I am not just this perspective. I am not just the I.
Boysen's pointing to his head there when he says that. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I'm not just this limited perspective. I can also refer to the universe and look at things from different perspectives, bigger perspective, outside perspectives. Nice.
That's a great point.
Which I'm liking this arrow and circle idea, because it doesn't mean that we have to let go. And this is here it is, dudes. Is like, you don't have to let go of any of that other juicy, good stuff. Right? I love competition. I love bumping chests. I love being up against it. I love that drive. I love all that stuff. And there's more. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's more.
I think you just put it there. It's not an or, it's an and. And yet, I think we have so much competition, I think, Boysen, that we can't even see it. It's like, it's water we swim in. And actually being a father was one of the things that helped me see it, because every single thing that my kids could do as we were growing up was about competition. Soccer, baseball, even some of the art stuff was about, going into competitions with my daughter, especially, who was interested in art. And not enough of the things that are more about progression, that are not competitive. Like I think of martial arts in that vein. Like my kids did Aikido for a little while. And then I read a book that it's called No Contest. And I'm not forgetting the author at the moment, but a friend of mine referred it to me, and it really helped me see that water more fully. And it really dovetailed with my experience as a man, where I've been racked with anxiety over the course of my life at different points in sports and in other kinds of competitions. And I hope that, part of what I can offer to guys is saying, there's probably a lot of, I see myself as like a canary in the coal mine a little bit. Like I'm a sensitive guy, and all this competition has been pretty painful to me. It maybe hasn't been as painful to you, but it may be keeping you from seeing, you might not be seeing what's possible if you don't just live in that world. And if you can look at this other world as well.
Beautiful. And I think that Beautiful. Let's go back to the pain for a minute. I think for a lot of us, and I resonate. I resonate with you about this too. Competition for me in a lot of my early life was extraordinarily painful. It was about, it was a story about not measuring up. It was a story about not being good enough. It was a story about being unworthy. It was a story, personal tale for me. My older brother, one of my older brothers, was a wrestler, and we lived in upstate New York. New York is a big wrestling state. Like wrestling's a big deal in New York. And my brother Wes was a 177 class state champion wrestler.
Wow.
And in New York, that's a big effing deal to be a state champion 177 wrestler. And I never measured up to that. Right. And so what did I do with all of that competitive stuff that I actually have, that I actually can enjoy today? I stuffed it away. So shadow, here we go. Mankind Project, right? I stuffed it away, put it into shadow, put all that stuff away. It wasn't until my 30s.
internal self-loathing-ish stuff kind of, is that what you're getting at?
Self-loathing, yeah, right. And stopped competing, stopped trying.
Yeah.
Took myself completely off of the kind of path of progression that you were just referring to. That's a much healthier way of looking at. And so martial arts, there's a lot of that in martial arts. But in my 30s, I started attending a gym and found a gym, and I'm just going to shout out Ken and Jolie, did CrossFit, but it was in a particular community where love and acceptance and progression, and you're competing against yourself, and you can be here and have fun with other people.
Yeah.
Like that, I've been able to reclaim a lot of that stuff. Right. So it's like, I can be, and then I can be both. I can encompass all of that stuff. So beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And if you don't know the story of Kali and the Raktabishas, that's the story he was referring to. The demons are out there, and if you try to fight the demons just keep reproducing and reproducing and reproducing, and there are more and more and more of them. And the only way that Kali was able to defeat the Raktabishas was by devouring all of them. Yeah.
That particular story was kind of freaky and wonderful. the one that Steph Snyder talked about was some other two monster dudes whose names I can't remember right now. They're like Chandra or something else, but it all kind of fits together, I think. And you have to kind of consume it and digest this stuff to kind of get past and not avoid it, right? I think there's the way in which I had to confront that sense of constant competition and ego that is part of that, I think, as I thought about that other guy, Boysen. So yeah, thanks for bringing the Kali story.
It's great.
Back.
Men's work challenge that we can just issue to the room here too. So when we create these kinds of spaces where men can actually get together and share this stuff in a vulnerable way, some of the most powerful exchanges between men I've ever witnessed have been men owning and recognizing that stuff about each other to each other's faces. You intimidate the hell out of me.
Yeah.
Here's all of the things that I project onto you. You annoy me because, and this that Carl Jung, right? The things that annoy us about other people are reflections of our own projections, right? So you get under my skin, you trigger the hell out of me, and then seeing how we are alike. Those kinds of exchanges in men's work are just incredible to watch. Guys get honest about stuff like that. Talk more about let's go back to reinventing masculinity and the liberating power of compassion and connection.
Sure.
So you co-wrote that book with Dr. Ed Adams, and Ed Adams was a previous president of the American Psychological Association's Division 51 for the study of men and masculinities. That's the thing, right? So talk more about liberating masculinity, and maybe this will lead us into an APA conversation also.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you a funny story about the term liberating masculinity, or it's kind of funny in the 8th grade sense, Boysen, is that our first term was going to be confined masculinity goes to expanding masculinity. And we're like, okay, one of the publisher editors is like, do you realize you're talking about an erection? You know, you just got to like be mindful. Like it's probably not going to fly. So we went, but then liberating was actually a more powerful word for us that really got at the notion of freedom and to live more fully with more options for the roles you can play, not just the protector, provider, say conqueror, reproducer guy, but like spiritual seeker, caregiver, devoted dad, that aren't as sanctioned under that older rule. And then also in the ways we relate to others. And by that, I'm thinking about like, can we go into emotional and receptive places and expressive places? Can we be more collaborative, not just butting heads? So that's one way in which liberating masculinity frees people, but we deliberately chose the gerund. If you're a word geek, like it's liberating. It's not liberated because it's about doing it for other people too. It's not just that you get free, but the process allows guys to free their spouses, if they're wives, if they're married, heterosexual marriage, to let them be fuller in the way they operate. That frees their kids, their people they work with. There's a whole chain reaction that can come out of men breaking out of that box. As a lot of folks talk about, including Mark Green, but what we called confined masculinity, with these really limited ways of operating and being a man. So that, in a nutshell, is liberating masculinity. And one way we think about it also is, at least in the work world, if I could apply that briefly, Boysen, is that the old one all ends up leaving men rigid, cold, and isolated in a work world and a world overall. I would say that's calling for agility, warmth, and connection. So it's not just a nice to have, as I see it, in Ed and I would see it also. It's a must have for guys to succeed increasingly, but also to like save the planet. We got to be more interdependent and see our collective challenges in front of us and not go into our tribal spheres or our own little rocks. So that's a bit about liberating masculinity.
So I just wrote down the time marker on that because that'll be that. I'm going to pull that back. What you just said, I'll pull
Cool.
that back out for the show notes because that was brilliant.
Thank you.
And workplaces. So let's go. You have a level of expertise about workplaces and this kind of modeling and how do we bring these things into workplaces. So talk about your experience. Tell me about what a Teal team is. Tell me about what a Teal workplace is. Talk more about how does this idea of liberating masculinity impact us in workspaces.
Sure. Thank you for that invitation. This word Teal, I'm part of a group called the Teal team. I helped co-found this group. We are about pursuing more soulful organizations at a high level. It's a term that reflects stages of human development and consciousness, borrowing from like Ken Wilber's work. And Teal is right now this pinnacle consciousness, which is it blends the masculine and the feminine for one thing. And within organizational cultures, it has three pillars: self-management, so much more that shared decision-making and autonomy we were talking about earlier, Boysen. It has holism, and that means you can bring your whole self to work, including that even the spiritual side of yourself. An emotional side, which has been kind of banned by a more mechanical, hyper-masculine approach. And the last one is about evolving purpose. So there's a sense that not only are we purpose-driven as opposed to profit-driven, but we're mindful of how that's changing over time and attuned to what's going on in us and in the world.
Yes. I'm looking for the book up on the shelf. French author whose name I'm missing right now.
Reinventing Organizations. Yes, that's been one of my Bibles. He's Frederick Laloux, a former McKinsey guy, articulated this all in a book called Reinventing Organizations about 6 or 7 years ago now. And that actually got me put on the path to the Reinventing Masculinity book, which directly echoes his title, right? Like Reinventing Organizations, Reinventing Masculinity. with a very tealy book cover. So he kind of identified that this is where you need to move from these hyper competitive, achievement oriented organizations that don't make space for the emotional, that are kind of machines where people are cogs in them, to much more alive organization that are also flexible, that are agile, that sense and respond from people all over the organization. They're really the ones that are going to best navigate a more tumultuous future, Boysen. And so I had this notion at one point, to connect these dots for you a little bit more. We're often trying to be the man of steel in organizations. We're trying to be Superman. Do it all ourselves, invulnerable, able to, leap tall buildings in a single bound. But it often leads us, to fail in ways that I was speaking before. We're kind of stiff, and we're not really warm necessarily, and we're isolated on our own. We got to go from being the man of steel to men of teal. And the men of teal piece is a lot of what we talk about. It's directly aligned with this idea of a wider way of operating, a way of being alive, where you got the arrow and the circle, so you can be compassionate and connected, besides assertive and muscular at times. So that is kind of what we're seeing is where the workplace is going, and I could share some interesting research that sort of supports it too. But that's the high level idea.
So from a very entry level place, when you go into an organization with the Teal team, what are the first couple of things that you are doing to introduce these new frames into organizations?
One thing is that we're trying to help people see themselves. There's that mirror role. Like, do you see that you're operating in a way that is pretty mechanical, that doesn't allow space for people to share feelings, talk about being stressed about the pandemic, because a lot still are like that? I mean, there's been progress there. Do you see that you're operating in a way that kind of shuts off the creativity and contributions of the vast majority of your people, because they're seen more as hands alone or cogs? And are you noticing that you're not fast enough? What we talk about is that the world is getting faster, flatter, and more fairness focused. Faster, quicker change of pace. Flatter, you need to be working across functional to get good ideas and innovative ideas, to get you mix and match, and also get to have more people sensing and responding to the surrounding environment, the business climate. And the fairness focused piece is like, we can't just keep going along with these white men thinking that they born on third base and thinking that they hit a triple. Like we've had advantages as guys, and the Teal concept is like, let's be real here. It ties into the DEI insights. So all that to say, we try to kind of hold up a mirror and observe what's going on, and let people see there are alternatives. And there are some amazing case studies of companies thriving when they start adopting these principles.
Are you familiar with, I'm guessing you are, I'll let you say it if so, the Google Teams research that was conducted 4 or 5 years ago? And just boil down, I saw the thumbs up, boil down, what was the bottom line that Google figured out after researching their highest performing teams?
That was psychological safety. That's what, am I referring to that study? Right. Like,
yes.
It wasn't whether who's the smartest, who's the most credentialed, they looked at like dozens of factors, I think. And what it boiled down to was, do people feel safe enough to bring their whole selves to the conversation and not feel mocked? Can we really, it's about relationships, and that gets to that wholeness piece. I can bring myself here, and I can share my doubts, my ideas, and I'm not going to be sort of ridiculed, in some of those older, I would say hyper masculine ways where you're just always trying to one up each other. This is the key. And so that's that's a great foundation for moving organizations forward, that research, Boysen.
Really, really well said. Good. I'm going to put a frame on the last part of the conversation here. So Dr. Ed Adams and you ended up being really connected to this in writing Reinventing Masculinity, because it was around the same time that the APA released their findings guidelines for working with men and boys. And there was a huge amount of backlash about those findings. So and I'm going to frame our conversation like from a loving, welcoming, holistic perspective, what is it that we have to say to men and women, because it wasn't just men who were reacting and backlashing against that. What's the kind of response to people who really react strongly to this idea that some aspects of traditional masculinity actually harm men's mental and physical health?
I try to bring compassion to it, and an invitation to be curious about what's going on, to listen to these points of view, because I think there's a lot of gender confusion right now. I mean, that's a term I think Ed, the other Ed, came up with as we talked about roles are being changed rapidly in all the newer movements around transgender and transsexual rights and pronouns and non-binary identities. It's a lot for older generation folks to get their heads around and hearts around. And so I think there's a way in which there's a lot of sort of feeling backed into a corner or feeling attacked when what they were told is a good man, or what a good man looks like, is all of a sudden described as actually a harmful thing for themselves. And then also they get all the messages around Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And so white men are, a simplistic reading of that is all white men are bad. And so I think, I think we need to call out bad behavior, especially about some of our political leaders, and also try to talk about healing. That's the framework that I found most valuable. One of my colleagues, Sean Harvey, I don't know if you're familiar with him. I think we may have been together with him. He's helped me see that frame is a very valuable one, that we've been wounded by the way we've been told to be men. We've, as Bell Hooks would say, our love and our connection with our mothers and with other guys has been like severed, chopped off. And so there's a lot of healing that's I think needed. And so if we can try to give each other a lot of grace in this moment, at least that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. That's well said. So curiosity, compassion, openness to questioning too, right? Just the idea like, hey, can you recognize that a little salt on your burger is a very delicious thing, and a pile of salt on your burger may not be so healthy for you?
Love it.
And we can think about ourselves, like, right? I
love that analogy. Yeah.
Little bit of competition, awesome, fun, stimulating, dopamine inducing, adrenaline driving, an overabundance of that, high blood pressure, hypertension, anxiety disorders, and heart attacks, right?
Yes. And can you have folks experience the dopamine rush, all of the positive feelings that come from the other side? The bro hug, that's not just a shoulder hug, but a bear hug, and the level of intimacy that it can come if you start, letting your guard down a bit. I think it's a both and, right? Like,
yes.
See that there's richness in all of us, in all parts of us, but we've kind of walled off that whole part of ourselves. And so how do we invite people into that?
Beautiful. Ed, this has been super enjoyable. I'm sure there's way more that we could go into. And as we're wrapping up, how would you like folks to get in touch with you and learn more about what you're doing?
Thanks for that invitation, Boysen. LinkedIn, you can find me there. I also have a website at edfrauenheim.com. And this Teal team that we talked about is thetealteam.com. So any of those are great ways to get in touch. And really, I'm seeing myself at my best as a humble warrior in the work of advancing, how we operate, how we can view gender roles and masculinity. So happy to team up with folks, and I really appreciate the work you've done, Boysen, and the wider Mankind Project. You guys have been carrying the torch for a long time, and I'm kind of a Johnny-come-lately, really. But I am honored to be on this path and in this work with you.
Thank you so much. So everybody, that's Ed Frauenheim. So I will have links to his LinkedIn down below, as well as a couple of the books that we've talked about here today where you can learn more. We've referenced in passing a lot of extraordinarily powerful writers and thinkers. Today I'll try and put some of those into the show notes. And Ed, I hope you'll come back and hang out with me again.
That sounds good, boy. So you can't get rid of me, man. We're on the moonshot. We're on the rocket ship together here, dude.
Very good. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
This has been another episode of the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. We have been your hosts, Paul Newell, Boysen Hodgson, and myself, Brandon Clift, and we want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. If you want to find out more about today's guests and support them in their mission, you can find links to them in the show notes. Now, if you have found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, we are always grateful for a rating and review of the show on iTunes. Now, we've got to give special thanks to our back-end team, producer, editor, and audio ninja for the show, Michael J. Russer, and Don Huff, who takes care of our graphics and promotions and pretty much makes us look pretty. So, of course, thank you, Don. Now, above all else, we've got to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you have made it possible for us to let men all over the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if something in this episode has touched you, then perhaps it is the call to action to get involved in men's work. With live trainings happening constantly and in-person trainings happening all over the world, the Mankind Project definitely has something for you. Now, if you've enjoyed the music in this episode and all of our episodes, be sure to check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, just know, what it means to me to be a man is completely different than what it means for you. What it means for Paul, what it means for Boysen, that is the beauty of this journey. So if you are looking for guidance, support, and community as you begin to unpack and dive deeper into your men's work journey, then you know where to find us. Same place, same time, next week. Lots of love. We'll see you then.